Last week I gave a talk at the National Weather Service about one of my favorite topics, big snowstorms in Pennsylvania. And that started a conversation about a saying we meteorologists hear a lot, that it's not nearly as snowy now as it was in the good old days. So I thought I'd check this folklore out in a couple ways. First, a relatively short-term approach. Here's the so-called normal winter snowfall computed from the period 1971 to 2000. I've included the major stations and a few others to fill in the gaps. Here's York, Shippensburg, Ebensburg, and Kane. Notice the large range from 90 inches or so in the Alleghenies in the northwest to about 20 inches in the southeast. Now here's the percentage of those averages that has fallen during the last 5 years. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are close to average, in the northwest a bit above, but most of the Ridge and Valley Province and the Piedmont Plateau have been below average. Now for a longer term look, I'll focus on two places with more than 100 years of data. State College to represent the higher elevations of central Pennsylvania, and Harrisburg, more typical of the lower elevations southeast of the mountains. And I'll compare the average snowfall over all the years, the 30-year average, and the average over the last 10 years. And notice the 100-plus year averages and the 30-year averages are close in both places, but the last 10 years have been significantly less snowy. Now let me look a little closer at the last century or so by computing the average snowfall by decade for those cities going back to the start of the last century. Here's the story for Harrisburg, and the dashed line represents the long-term average. Certainly the 1960s stand head and shoulders above the rest, with the 1970s and the first 2 decades of last century a bit above average. The 1930s, the 1950s, and the present decade are well below the average line. Now here's the picture for State College, where, as in Harrisburg, the 1930s were not very snowy, but on the snowy side, the 1960s again jump out along with the 1970s. The 1990s are up there too because of a few extraordinarily snowy winters that dominate the average. And you can actually see that if we look at the data in a way that plays off our tendency to remember snowy winters. Here I simply counted the number of winters each decade when snowfall was above average. So 5 means half the years above and half below. I put both cities on here, State College in black and Harrisburg in blue. And notice the 1990s in State College, just 4 years above average. Now by this measure, the current decade and the 1930s really stand out for a lack of snowy winters. And on the snowy side, there's the 1960s again, the only decade with 7 above average snowfall years at both cities. The only other decade that comes close is the 1910s. So, if you're looking for those elusive good old days and the subject is snowfall, the evidence certainly points to the 1960s. And if that's not far enough back for you, 5 decades before that might also qualify. Paul Knight is back with the extended forecast next.